On January 20, 1906, inside a mansion in downtown São Paulo, one of the state's most respected politicians approached his own daughter, put a revolver to her forehead, and pulled the trigger. Minutes later, he would also be dead. The case shocked the São Paulo elite and Brazil, made headlines in the newspapers of the time, and to this day remains surrounded by questions. How did an influential senator come to commit such a brutal crime inside his own home? And why, years after this tragedy, did the city of São Paulo decide to honor this man who killed his own daughter by giving his name to a street? I'm Marcos Campos, and this is one of the answers we're going to try to find in this story. And for that, we'll need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century. Go ahead and leave a like and a comment, even if it's just an emoji. Become a member if you can, it really helps me with the productions. Now let's get to the facts. Francisco de Assis Peixoto Gomide Jr. was born in the city of São Paulo on March 24, 1849. He was the son of Francisco de Assis Peixoto Gomide and Clara Bueno Peixoto. He was born into a family that already had a presence in public life in São Paulo. His father had been a provincial deputy and a national deputy during the empire, which placed the Gomide family among the traditional groups of São Paulo politics in the 19th century. Following the common path among young people of the elite in that country, Gomide entered the law school of Largo de São Francisco in São Paulo, the main institution for training the Brazilian legal and political elite in the 19th century. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in legal and social sciences in 1873. While still young, he began working as a public prosecutor in the district of Amparo, in the interior of São Paulo. Shortly after, he became more actively involved in politics and journalism. In 1880, together with Bernardino, he founded Campos, the Republican newspaper at the time, advocating for Republican ideas that were beginning to gain strength in the country during the last years of the empire. With the proclamation of the Republic in 1889, his political career gained new momentum. Gomide began to hold important administrative positions in the state and became closer to the Paulista Republican Party, which would dominate state politics during the first decades of the Republic. In 1893, he was elected state senator, having a career of great influence within the São Paulo legislature. Shortly after, he became president of the São Paulo State Senate, a position of enormous political relevance at that time. In the political structure of that time, the president of the State Senate could take over the state government under certain circumstances. That is exactly what happened several times, and Gomide even served as interim governor of São Paulo at different moments between 1896 and 1898. During absences of the office holder, in his political career, he took part in several administrative initiatives of the state. Among them were projects related to railway expansion, immigration policies, and also support for charitable institutions and public education. At the beginning of the 20th century, Peixoto Gomide was seen as an experienced politician, well-connected and deeply involved in the circles of power in the capital of São Paulo. He was married to Ambrosina Pinto Nunes Gomide, with whom he had children. The family lived in a large mansion on what was then Rua da Princesa, in downtown São Paulo, now called Rua Benjamin Constant. The residence was located between two key points of the city at that time, Praça da Sé and Largo de São Francisco, where the famous law school operated. It was in this environment that the senator's children grew up. Among them was Sofia Gomide. Sofia was 22 years old at the beginning of 1906. As was common among young women from traditional families at the time, her education was mainly focused on domestic life and marriage. And at that particular moment, the family home was filled with preparations for a ceremony that was quickly approaching. Sofia was engaged. The wedding date had already been set. There was only 1 week left until the wedding. The man who was about to marry Sofia Gomide was named Manuel Batista Cepelos. He was born on December 10, 1872 in the city of Cotia, which was then a small rural area on the outskirts of São Paulo. His father was Antonio Batista Cepelos, a primary school teacher. The family did not belong to the economic or political elite of São Paulo, which made Manuel's path very different from Sofia's. While she grew up in an environment of social prestige and financial stability, Cepelos worked his way up professionally. While still young, he worked as a soldier in the São Paulo Public Force, the organization that would later become the current state military police. Over time, he decided to invest in his academic education and enrolled in the law school of Largo de São Francisco, one of the most important institutions in the country at that time, as we have seen. The college brought together students from different regions of Brazil and served as a true center for the formation of the political and intellectual elite of the First Republic. Cepelos completed his law degree and began his career at the São Paulo Public Prosecutor's Office, working as a public prosecutor in cities in the interior of the state. Alongside his legal career, he also devoted himself to literature. He wrote poetry and even published a few books in the early 20th century. His work caught the attention of important figures in the Brazilian literary scene at the time. The poet Olavo Bilac, one of the central figures of the Parnassian movement, even praised his work and wrote the preface to one of his books. Within the intellectual and legal circles of São Paulo's capital, Cepelos began to gain some recognition, and it was in this environment that he met Sofia Gomide. There are no detailed records about the exact circumstances of their first meeting, but it is likely that contact did occur. Within the social circles that connected jurists, politicians, and intellectuals linked to the law school and the city's cultural environments, the relationship evolved, and at some point in the early 1900s, the two became engaged. Initially, Peixoto Gomide approved of the relationship. Some historical accounts even suggest that the senator went so far as to help Cepelos at certain points during his academic training, which indicates that there was a close relationship between the two before the engagement. When the wedding was officially announced, the ceremony was scheduled for January 27, 1906. But as the date approached, comments began to surface in the social circles of the capital. Part of São Paulo's elite viewed the marriage with suspicion, to say the least. Cepelos' social background, as the son of a teacher and himself a former soldier in the public force and a poet, contrasted with the status of the Gomide family, who held an important place in São Paulo's politics. In São Paulo, in the Cerrado, in the 20th century, which was deeply marked by rigid social hierarchies, this kind of union could generate criticism and malicious comments. Some chronicles from that time even record the kind of remarks that circulated among the members of the São Paulo elite. And can you believe that Gomide is going to marry his daughter to a bohemian, a poet? Even so, the preparations for the wedding continued steadily. Inside the Gomide family mansion, os dias passavam entre visitas, conversations and organization of the ceremony. The days before the crime. As January 1906 went on, the preparations for Sofia's wedding entered the final stage. The ceremony was scheduled for January 27, and inside the family's mansion in downtown São Paulo, the final details of the celebration were beginning to be organized. At that time, weddings like these among the São Paulo elite were very important social events. It wasn't seen as just a union between two people. It was an event that mobilized family and social networks. Guests were carefully handpicked. Clothes were prepared in advance, and the family's own house became a place of constant activity. Later accounts indicate that outwardly, everything seemed very normal. Sofia remained involved in the wedding preparations, as was common at the time, right? Part of the trousseau, in fact, was being prepared by herself. Embroidery and items she would use in married life, in running her household. At the same time, family friends were already talking about how close the ceremony was. But inside the house, some people began to notice changes in Peixoto Gomide's behavior. Maybe for him the ceremony wasn't approaching, or at least it shouldn't have been. Look, testimonies mentioned by chroniclers and also historians indicate that the senator had been showing signs of restlessness. He was moving more quietly than usual, and at certain moments he seemed worried or lost in thought, like he was keeping to himself, as if something was weighing on his mind. The historian Roberto Pompeu de Toledo, in his book A Capital da Vertigem, mentions that Gomide was showing signs of melancholy and anxiety during that period. According to these accounts, the senator even sought psychiatric help in the days leading up to the tragedy. And this detail is particularly significant when you consider the context of that time. At the beginning of the 20th century, seeking medical help for emotional or psychological issues was still uncommon among men of the political elite. This suggests that Gomide's emotional state might have been causing real concern among those close to him. Some versions of the story also indicate that he had confided to friends that he was deeply distressed about the situation involving his daughter. These accounts, however, mainly appear in historical reconstructions made years after the crime and not in official documents from that time. Even so, they help illustrate the tense atmosphere that apparently developed in the days leading up to the wedding. At the same time, the social pressure surrounding the union between Sofia and Cepelos continued to be discussed in São Paulo's elite circles. High-end gossip, you know? The fact that the daughter of an influential senator was marrying someone from what was considered a modest background was still a topic of conversation and comments. Cepelos, a bohemian poet. In a society marked by very rigid social hierarchies, family reputation was extremely important. For public figures like Peixoto Gomide, the opinion of their peers, other politicians, jurists, and members of the economic elite carried significant weight. The question I'm already anticipating here is, was that weight really so heavy as to make him do what he did? Hold on and you can comment in a moment. Well, even so, as far as historical records indicate, nothing openly suggested, at least, that the wedding would be cancelled. Afternoon of January 20, 1906. It was Saturday, January 20, 1906. In downtown São Paulo, the Gomide family's mansion was following its normal routine. In the late afternoon, the residence was located on what was then Rua da Princesa, a street situated between Praça da Sé and Largo de São Francisco. The central areas were very important for the political, legal, and social life of the city. Inside that house, the servants were there doing their usual household chores, making coffee, baking cookies. At that time, the homes of influential families usually had cooks, maids, and other workers responsible for organizing the family's daily routine. In the dining room, Sofia Gomide was sitting at the table. She was embroidering a piece of the trousseau she would use after her wedding. It was something quite common among young women. Even so, in wealthy families, embroidery was part of the traditional preparation for domestic life. Sofia was only 22 years old. There was only 1 week left until her wedding. Meanwhile, her father was walking around in the same room. Reports indicate that Peixoto Gomide was walking around the room in that way I mentioned to you, kind of gloomy, a bit restless, introspective. He paced back and forth. At a certain moment, he approached his daughter, pulled out a revolver, stood near her, got even closer, and pressed it against the young woman's forehead. She was frightened and surprised. She asked, "Dad, what is this?" The answer came immediately. "It's nothing." And he pulled the trigger. The shot hit Sofia in the forehead. The young woman died instantly. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the mansion. An echo so loud that I would say it's still echoing today. Servants and family members ran toward the dining room, and when they got there, they found Sofia lying on the floor. And Peixoto Gomide was still holding the gun. Among the people who witnessed the scene were members of his own family, including his wife and other children. Amid the shock, there was another tense moment. According to reports, Gomide even raised the gun again and pointed it at his other daughter. One of the housemaids at that moment started screaming and begged him to stop. That was when he lowered the revolver. Without saying a word, he turned around and left the room. He walked down the hallway of the mansion to a sitting room. That was where the family's piano was. He sat down, holding the gun. Then, he tried to take his own life. The first shot, believe it or not, failed. For a few moments, there was silence inside the house. Then, he spun the cylinder again. He tried again and this time succeeded. The bullet entered near his ear. Peixoto Gomide fell to the sitting room floor. Shortly after, he was dead. Inside that mansion, in a matter of minutes, 2 lives had been cut short, with no obvious explanation. The senator, 56 years old, one of the most influential figures in São Paulo politics, and his 22-year-old daughter, who was preparing to get married a week later. The news of the crime, of course, spread like bad news does. The incident was already being talked about everywhere in the capital. In the following days, the newspapers in São Paulo started treating the case as one of the most shocking tragedies ever recorded in São Paulo society. Well, guys, now we need to talk about what happened next, right? Before I finish going through the whole history of the case itself. This is where those speculations, theses, theories, hypotheses, and so on come in. Since it was a homicide followed by suicide, there wasn't really any investigative or legal process to follow, right? Since the perpetrator of the crime had also died, so people started to ask why, out of nowhere, killing his daughter like that a week before her wedding. Everything indicated that he accepted the relationship between the two, right? He had even helped the young man at a certain point. So what could have been going on, right? And then, several hypotheses started to emerge that could explain this. Among the most accepted ones, I would say, is the idea that he might have had a psychotic episode for some reason. These behaviors he had been showing, like becoming introspective. What could have been going on in his head, nobody knows. Maybe it all exploded that day. So that was what was most accepted, let's say, right? Although I need to tell you that some deaths among the elite back then always had some elements like, oh, it was a breakdown. Because maybe they didn't want to investigate who they needed to. Things just went on like that. If that's what happened, I have no idea. I'm just sharing this with you. Another hypothesis that came up, and this is one of those that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it was going around, is that at some point before the wedding, maybe during that period when he started acting strange, right? Peixoto Gomide. They say he found out that Cepelos could be his daughter's half-brother. The story goes that a woman had worked at their family's house, a former enslaved person. She stayed there for some time and something ended up happening. And this young man, Manuel Batista Cepelos, was supposedly that child. There's no confirmation of this either. Because, why would he only find out about it later, right? If there's any basis to it. If he really was the son of that person who worked there but not his own son, and that's why he helped, that could also be something to consider. But his own son? So how did he only find out close to the wedding? Who told him? Was this covered up at the time? Did he only find out later? Then he started connecting the dots. In other words, nothing conclusive, right? There were a lot of rumors, but no official document to back it up. But since it was brought up, I'm here discussing it with you. Because for a father to go up to his 22-year-old daughter, put a gun to her forehead and pull the trigger, he has to be really determined to do it, or really having a breakdown, or have a very strong motivation, right? Because if you think about the rumors that were coming up there, which I mentioned to you, right? About prejudice, that weighed heavily on him. Because he was a guy, right? He was well regarded there and all. But that's what I asked before. Was that weight really so great that it would make him do something so terrible to his own daughter? It doesn't really seem to make much sense. But when we're in the world of true crime, nothing really makes much sense, right? People are capable of anything. We've already seen that here. But anyway, I'm just presenting the main possibilities for a possible motive. Leave a comment here and tell me what you think. And now I need to talk to you, moving on, about what happened to poor Cepelos, right? The fate of Cepelos. For Manuel Batista Cepelos, the tragedy that happened on January 20, 1906 deeply marked his life, a definitive rupture in his life. The man who was supposed to marry Sofia, just a few days after the crime, began to carry an unbearable weight from that episode on his shoulders. At the time of the murder, Cepelos was a public prosecutor in the interior of the state. He was a respected professional within the public prosecutor's office and was also beginning to gain recognition in the literary circles of the capital. But the impact was devastating, let's say. Historical records indicate that shortly after the tragedy, he was transferred to the city of Itapetininga in the interior of São Paulo state. The move was part of the administrative routine of the public prosecutor's office, but it also served in many cases as a way to distance public figures from socially embarrassing situations. In Itapetininga, Cepelos tried to continue his career. Even so, later reports suggest that he never fully recovered from the trauma he experienced. In the years that followed, his presence in the literary and legal circles of São Paulo became increasingly discreet. Over time, he ended up distancing himself from both literary activities and his public career. At some point in the following decade, he moved to Rio de Janeiro, which at that time was the federal capital of Brazil and the country's main political and cultural center. There he began to live an increasingly private life. Some reports suggest that he faced financial difficulties and distanced himself from the intellectual circles he used to frequent so diligently. His name, which once appeared in literary and legal circles, was gradually forgotten, disappearing from public life. Thus, in May 1915, 9 years after Sofia's death, Cepelos was found dead in the Catete neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. The body was found near the rocks along the coastline in that part of the city at the beginning of the 20th century. the circumstances of the death were never fully clarified. Some versions indicate suicide, suggesting that he threw himself from the rocks. Other hypotheses mentioned the possibility of an accidental fall. Cepelos was known to have vision problems. Reports mention that he was nearsighted, and some contemporaries raised the hypothesis that he might have gotten too close to the spot and slipped. No conclusive investigation was able to determine exactly what had happened. In any case, his death tragically ended the story of a man whose life had been deeply marked by the events of that January in 1906, a strange irony of history. História. In the years following the tragedy that involved the Gomide family, it continued to be remembered. Chronicles, accounts, books. But as the decades went by, the public memory of the episode began to change. In 1914, a few years after the death of Peixoto Gomide, the city of São Paulo decided to honor the politician. I'm not sure if you'd call him a politician or something else, but a street was named after him. Rua Peixoto Gomide, located in the area that would later become one of the most valuable neighborhoods in the city, near Avenida Paulista. The name became part of the map of São Paulo's capital and stayed there for many years, a century. For most people who crossed that street every day, the name was just another historical reference in the city. It's likely that the tragedy would have been forgotten anyway. Few knew that behind that tribute was one of the cruelest, most tragic stories of a family that shocked São Paulo and Brazil in the 20th century. As time went by, the senator's name remained present in the city's urban geography. Meanwhile, the memory of poor Sofia Gomide, a 22-year-old young woman whose life was cut short that January afternoon, gradually faded from the records of popular history. Today, when researchers revisit this episode, many point out precisely this contrast. For decades, the city honored the man who committed this crime, while the victim remained practically forgotten. That's why I ask you, do you think the fairest name would be Sofia Gomide? Leave me a comment here. That's right, guys. Stories like this show that sometimes the hardest crimes to understand happen within families. And if you like real stories with lots of details, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, okay? Every week there are 3 episodes, and go ahead and leave me a comment here too. Which of the theories about the motive for this crime do you think is the most factual? I really appreciate your company. A kiss from the redhead, and see you in the next episode.